By the late 1990s, the world wanted to believe the most dangerous chapters of history were behind it. The Cold War was over. The superpowers had stepped back from the edge. And for the first time in decades, the idea of global war felt distant, almost unthinkable. But beneath the surface, nothing was truly calm. The United States and Iraq were locked in a slow-burning confrontation. Sanctions were tightening, military options were openly discussed, and intelligence agencies were watching for any sign that the balance might tip. At the same time, something else was changing quietly, almost invisibly. The US military was becoming dependent on computers. Networks controlled communications, logistics, and planning. Systems once isolated were now connected, and speed mattered more than caution. Security was an afterthought. There were no doctrines for cyber conflict. No rules explaining what a digital attack meant, or how it should be answered. If something went wrong inside these systems, no one could say whether it was a malfunction or the first move of a war. This uncertainty created a dangerous illusion of peace. Because when systems fail in the shadows, assumptions rush in to fill the silence. And assumptions, in a world already on edge, can be fatal. In early 1998, that silence was broken. Unusual activity began appearing inside US military networks. Subtle at first, easy to dismiss. But what followed would expose how close the world really was to disaster, and how the smallest actors could nearly trigger the largest consequences imaginable. In February 1998, system administrators across multiple US military networks began noticing irregularities they couldn't easily explain. User accounts appeared that no one remembered creating. Connections were logged at impossible hours. Files were accessed by machines that were never supposed to touch them. At first, the activity didn't trigger panic. Large networks misbehave all the time. Glitches happen. Logs get messy. But this was different. The same patterns were appearing across unrelated systems. Servers tied to the Department of Defense, NASA, and military logistics all showed signs of unauthorized access. What made it worse was the silence. There were no alarms screaming intrusion. No obvious signs of sabotage. Just quiet movement, as if someone were walking through secured rooms, careful not to knock anything over. As administrators dug deeper, the scope became alarming. Hundreds of machines were affected. Not just desktops, but servers handling sensitive communications and operational data. For the Pentagon, this was a worst-case scenario. These networks weren't just databases. They were part of the nervous system of the US military. If someone was inside them, the question wasn't what had already been taken, but what could be done next. The fear wasn't limited to espionage. Manipulated data could delay orders. False information could misdirect decisions. And in a climate already shaped by tension and mistrust, the implications were clear. If this wasn't an accident, then someone somewhere was testing the limits of American defense. And no one yet knew why. As reports of the intrusions moved up the chain of command, the language inside government briefings began to change. What had started as a technical anomaly was now being discussed in strategic terms. Words like breach gave way to threat. Unusual activity became hostile access. Because in 1998, there was no neutral way to interpret a digital intrusion into military systems. If someone was inside US defense networks, the assumption was simple and dangerous. They were not there by accident. Investigators traced fragments of network traffic beyond American borders. The connections were indirect, routed through foreign servers, masked by layers of infrastructure. But in an already tense geopolitical climate, nuance mattered less than narrative. The United States was facing off against Iraq. Airstrikes were openly debated. Military forces were positioned, waiting for justification. In that context, a cyber intrusion didn't exist in isolation. It became evidence. Evidence of preparation. Evidence of intent. Evidence that a hostile actor might be testing American defenses before something larger. Inside classified meetings, the unspoken question hung in the air. Was this the opening move? No one wanted to be the official who underestimated a threat. No one wanted to be remembered as the person who ignored warning signs. And so the assumptions hardened. Digital fingerprints were interpreted as strategy. Ambiguity became suspicion. And a situation that began with silent keystrokes started drifting toward real-world consequences. Because when fear fills the gaps left by uncertainty, escalation doesn't require proof. It only requires belief. In early 1998, the United States did not view Iraq as a distant concern. It was an active problem, one that dominated military planning and political debate. Weapons inspections were failing. Sanctions were tightening. And the possibility of airstrikes was no longer theoretical. Against this backdrop, the network intrusions took on a far more serious meaning. A cyber breach in peacetime is one thing. A cyber breach on the eve of potential conflict is something else entirely. Military planners began to consider the implications. If an enemy could access logistics systems, they could map troop movements. If communications were compromised, orders could be delayed or altered. And if false data were injected at the right moment, chaos could follow. The danger wasn't just theft. It was trust. Modern warfare depends on information being accurate, timely, and reliable. Once the trust is shaken, every decision becomes suspect. Inside the Pentagon, the fear was that this intrusion might be preparation. A way to weaken systems before a physical strike. A silent phase of a larger operation. And because cyber warfare had no established rules, there was no clear threshold for response. How severe did a digital intrusion need to be before it justified retaliation? At what point did keyboards become weapons? These questions had no answers, only consequences. As the investigation continued, pressure mounted to identify the source. Not eventually. Immediately. Because in a world already close to conflict, waiting for certainty could be interpreted as weakness. And hesitation, in moments like this, can be just as dangerous as overreaction. With uncertainty growing and political pressure rising, U.S. authorities made a decisive move. The investigation was formalized and given a codename, Operation Solar Sunrise. This was no longer a routine security review. It was a coordinated national response designed to answer one critical question. Who was inside America's military networks? The Department of Defense brought in the FBI. NASA security teams were alerted. Intelligence analysts were assigned to trace the digital trail wherever it led. For the first time, cyber defense became a multi-agency operation, operating under crisis conditions. Teams worked around the clock. Compromised systems were isolated. Entire network segments were taken offline without warning. The goal wasn't just containment, it was clarity. Investigators needed to determine whether this was espionage, sabotage, or the early stages of a coordinated attack. Every log file was examined. Every access point questioned. And yet, the deeper they looked, the stranger the picture became. The techniques used were effective, but not refined. The intrusions showed persistence, but not discipline. There was no sign of the careful planning typically associated with state-sponsored operations. Still, no one was ready to draw conclusions. Because in an environment shaped by fear, evidence is often interpreted through the lens of expectation. And at this stage, the expectation was clear. The attacker was assumed to be a foreign adversary. What Operation Solar Sunrise would soon reveal, however, would challenge every one of those assumptions and expose a far more uncomfortable truth. As Operation Solar Sunrise intensified, investigators began tracing the digital footprints left behind by the intrusions. IP addresses were logged, access times analyzed, connections mapped across continents. At first glance, the trail seemed to confirm everyone's fears. The traffic appeared to originate outside the United States. Some connections passed through servers in the Middle East. Others bounced across foreign infrastructure designed to obscure origin. In a different context, this might have raised questions. But in early 1998, it reinforced a narrative that already felt inevitable. Analysts began constructing profiles of a hostile actor. Briefings referenced foreign capabilities. Threat assessments quietly escalated. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The routing patterns were inconsistent. The infrastructure used was cheap, unstable, and poorly maintained. These were not the networks typically favored by professional intelligence services. More troubling were the mistakes. The attackers reused the same access methods repeatedly. They logged in from different locations without attempting to hide timing patterns. They left behind fragments of activity that suggested impatience rather than discipline. To experienced investigators, these details mattered. State-sponsored operations were cautious. They minimized exposure. They avoided noise. This intrusion did none of that. And yet, the assumption of a foreign enemy persisted. Because once a theory takes hold inside a crisis, abandoning it feels risky. Questioning it can look like doubt. And doubt, in moments of potential conflict, is often seen as weakness. So the investigation continued, chasing an enemy that didn't quite exist. While the real story waited quietly in the background, unnoticed. The breakthrough didn't come from a dramatic confession or a classified tip. It came from something far more mundane. Carelessness. As investigators reviewed chat logs, usernames, and access records, a different pattern began to emerge. The digital trail didn't point toward military facilities or intelligence compounds. It pointed toward bedrooms, school schedules, and home internet connections. The attackers were active late at night, after homework hours, on weekends. They reused online aliases across forums and messaging platforms. Some even bragged about their access, unaware that they were being watched. Slowly, the impossible became undeniable. These were not trained operatives. They weren't soldiers. They weren't even adults. They were teenagers. Young hackers with curiosity, spare time, and access to the internet. Some had no clear understanding of the systems they had entered, only that they were cool places to explore. There was no ideology driving them. No political goal. No intention to provoke conflict. They had found open doors and walked through them. For investigators, the realization was deeply unsettling. Weeks of escalation, fear, and strategic planning had been built on the assumption of a foreign enemy. Now that assumption collapsed. But the danger didn't disappear with it. Because the damage wasn't defined by intent. It was defined by perception. And for a brief moment in 1998, the world's most powerful military had nearly treated teenage curiosity as an act of war. What made Operation Solar Sunrise truly disturbing wasn't who carried out the intrusion. It was how little resistance they encountered along the way. The teenagers didn't use classified tools. They didn't rely on insider access or advanced exploits. Most of what they used was freely available online. At the time, many military and government systems were poorly maintained. Security patches were delayed or ignored. Outdated software remained connected to critical networks long past its safe lifespan. In some cases, default passwords were never changed. In others, user permissions were misconfigured, allowing access far beyond what was intended. Once inside, the attackers faced almost no monitoring. Intrusion detection systems were rare. Real-time alerts were limited or non-existent. This allowed them to move laterally, exploring system after system without triggering immediate alarms. To them, it felt like discovery. To the Pentagon, it was a structural failure. The breach revealed a dangerous assumption: that sensitive networks were secure simply because they were military. They weren't. Security depended on human decisions, and those decisions had prioritized convenience over protection. Operation Solar Sunrise shattered that illusion. It demonstrated that cyber defense wasn't about elite attackers or exotic threats. It was about fundamentals. And when those fundamentals were ignored, even teenagers could walk into the heart of national defense. Not with force, not with violence, but with time, curiosity, and an open connection. As investigators pieced together the truth, the sheer scale of what had almost happened became clear. For weeks, military and intelligence leaders had operated under the assumption of a foreign attack. Every alert, every anomaly, every breach report had been interpreted through that lens. Had a misstep occurred, a rushed decision, an overreaction, the United States could have taken real-world military action. Troops might have been deployed. Airstrikes could have been ordered. All based on a digital intrusion that, in reality, had no connection to a hostile nation. It was a near miss the world almost didn't know about. The realization that the attackers were teenagers shifted the narrative completely. Panic gave way to disbelief, then to embarrassment. Yet the danger remained. Even without malicious intent, the intrusion had revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited by others, far less forgiving actors. It was a stark reminder that in the digital age, accidents and curiosity could carry consequences as severe as intentional aggression. Officials publicly framed the event as a contained investigation. Privately, the lessons were serious. Policies were reviewed. Networks were fortified. Detection and monitoring systems were upgraded. Operation Solar Sunrise had avoided a tragedy not through luck alone, but through meticulous investigation, restraint, and a willingness to challenge initial assumptions. For a brief moment, the world had teetered on the edge of conflict. And it was almost invisible to everyone outside the Pentagon walls. The message was clear. In the modern era, the line between war and curiosity could be thinner than anyone imagined. Operation Solar Sunrise didn't just expose a group of teenage hackers. It exposed a nation's vulnerability in the dawn of the digital age. The breach forced the United States to rethink cybersecurity entirely. Policies were rewritten. Networks were hardened. New protocols were established to prevent even the smallest intrusions from escalating into national crises. Cybersecurity was no longer just a technical concern. It became a matter of national security strategy. And it wasn't limited to military networks. Critical infrastructure, communication systems, and even civilian networks were suddenly seen through a lens of risk. The teenagers who stumbled through Pentagon doors did more than break the rules. They revealed a systemic weakness that could have been exploited by far more dangerous actors. Operation Solar Sunrise became a blueprint, not for how the hackers operated, but for how a nation must respond to digital threats. It also changed public perception. The world realized that even the most powerful military could be vulnerable to small, unconventional threats. Digital attacks didn't require bombs or tanks, just opportunity and access. And the lessons remain relevant today. Modern cyber warfare is not theoretical. It is active, evolving, and relentless. And the question remains, if curiosity once nearly triggered a war, how prepared are we now? The story of Operation Solar Sunrise is a warning, a reminder, a call to vigilance. Because in a world where lines between war and everyday life are blurred by code, firewalls, and networks, even the smallest intrusion can carry the weight of a global crisis. And in that reality, awareness, preparation, and foresight aren't just important, they are essential.